Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear us? Can you hear me? Great. I'm pleased to welcome you to this plenary session. Please continue to enjoy your lunch.
It's not very loud.
It is live, though. Okay. Want to welcome you to this plenary session. Please continue to enjoy your lunches. But we have quite a wonderful program for you on the role of the UN Special Rapporteur. I think I've met most of you. I'm Mark Agras, the Executive Director of the Society, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here. Thanks again to our sponsoring host, UCLA School of Law, which has just been wonderful with all of the arrangements throughout the conference. Special rapporteurs. These are independent experts appointed by the UN Human Rights Council and certain other UN bodies to monitor, advise, and publicly report on matters within their mandates. Some special rapporteurs have mandates to examine specific human rights situations in individual countries. Others, including our three panelists today, have thematic mandates, more of a roving brief on specific subjects. The mandates cover a wide range of issues related to civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights, including the human rights of migrants, violence against women, the rights of internally displaced persons, freedom of religion, and arbitrary detention, among many other subjects. It also is a happy circumstance that many special rapporteurs are drawn from the ranks of none other than the American Society of International Law. And we're fortunate to have three of them today to talk with us about the role of the Special Rapporteur. Our panelists are Tendai Achiumi of UCLA Law, Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. Karima Benoon, UC Davis, Special Rapporteur in the field of Cultural Rights, and Sean Murphy, who, among other things, of course, is the president of ASIL and a professor of international law at George Washington Law, who is the Special Rapporteur on Crimes Against Humanity. So this is quite a gathering here. Very rare to get them all in one room, particularly when, as you will hear, they are supposed to be traveling the globe at almost any hour of any day. So very pleased to have you all. And I'd like to start out with a general question, which is, what is the function of a special rapporteur, and how does that function vary among the different UN bodies that appointed each of you? Why don't we start with Karima and go down the line?
So, put quite simply, I think our function is to speak truth to power, and we are somewhat uniquely situated in the UN system to be able to do that. I would say in terms of what we do, those of us who are appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, we have this fancy name, Rapporteur. Literally means we report. So we write 2 thematic reports a year, one for the Human Rights Council, one for the General Assembly. Not all special rapporteurs do 2, but I think most of us do. And we're also able to carry out country missions with, of course, the invitation of the country concerned, and we report on those to the Human Rights Council as well. We have a communications procedure which allows us to take up specific cases, either of particular violations or patterns of violations with governments on a confidential basis, and then we can also make public statements about the cases that we raise, although we don't do that systematically. Unfortunately, that's sort of an exceptional part of the work. And then there's sort of the public diplomacy part of sort of representing your issue and trying to advance your issue at the international level. And a big thanks to ASIL for giving us this opportunity to have this important discussion.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a delight to be here. I don't know how ASIL picked me to do it, but I'm glad it did. I feel a little bit like the odd duck up here for many reasons, but one reason is that my special rapporteurship is really quite different from Karima's and Tendai's. I'm a member of the UN International Law Commission, and the International Law Commission, as you may know, is a body of the UN that operates and has operated for 70 years as sort of a legal think tank for the UN, whereby we work in any given year on about 10 projects that ultimately might come to fruition as a draft treaty or possibly just a statement of black letter rules about international law with commentary that help states and other actors. So for each of those 10 projects, we typically appoint a special rapporteur. And that person's job is to basically drive the project through the commission. We do a report each year in roughly the January to March timeframe, which then serves as fodder for the work of the International Law Commission in Geneva over the summer. And so when we show up in Geneva, we're basically expected to have read the many reports of the special rapporteurs, to debate them in our plenary, to then move into a drafting committee where we refine whatever proposals have been made by the special rapporteur, and then we, produce as a commission conclusions or guidelines or draft articles with commentary by the end of the summer. So the basic role of the special rapporteur is to draft reports not for the General Assembly, but for the Commission itself, and to guide the Commission along the way with respect to whatever the particular project is. We have a wide range of topics we're working on right now. I'm the Special Rapporteur for Crimes Against Humanity, but we have topics on use Kogans, on provisional application of treaties, on protection of the environment in armed conflict. It's a wide array of subject matter areas extending well beyond just human rights. And so it requires a special rapporteur for whatever that topic is to take a deep dive into that area in order to guide the commission.
And thank you very much for the introduction and also for the platform. I'm moving away from our odd duck, Sean, because I'm coming down with a cold and I don't want to spread my germs in that direction. Yes, exactly. I don't want to contaminate the duck. And I also have to say that I'm going to have to leave either a little bit before the end of the panel, actually, to get on a flight to Geneva for special rapporteur-related obligations, and so I'm going to perform the life of a special rapporteur, which is actually never really being able to enjoy anything to its full extent, because something else is already waiting for you. In addition to what Karima said, I would just add perhaps two other dimensions that are implied in your, I think, wonderful overview. So I actually have to produce 4 reports instead of 2, which is, we can talk about what that feels like and what the lived experience of the 4 is. But I think one of the important aspects of producing the reports, in addition to delivering to the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council a statement as to, how a particular law applies to a situation, is in the lead up to the reports, you do consultations with different stakeholders, private actors, local government, national government, civil society, movement actors. And I think the mandate of the different special rapporteurs actually serves as a platform for knowledge exchange. So separate from the actual output of the report itself, these convenings allow for different groups that may not necessarily be in conversation about the thematic that your mandate is tied to really have a kind of conversation that can move things in the field in parallel or separate from what states end up doing with the reports once they get to the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly. So I think that convening power and the kind of knowledge exchange that takes place in that area is also really important.
Great. It might be of interest to this audience of future rapporteurs if you told us a little bit about what equips a person to take on a role like this, and perhaps how you found your way to being a special rapporteur. Maybe start with Tendai and go the other way.
Sure. So I think looking at the way the position is structured really tells you a lot about what it takes to do the job. So with our special rapporteurships, it's framed as a part-time job that requires 3 months of the year. That's what the official false statement that they use to recruit you says, because it's not actually a three-month obligation at all, but it's framed as a 3-month obligation that you do in addition to your full-time job, and it's an unpaid position. So from the beginning, there's an assumption that whatever it is that is your full-time job provides you with the expertise and the resources and the networks to be able to function at the level that is required for the job. So, being an academic, I think, is a very well-suited profession to be in, or career to be in, to do this work. And I know that my own appointment is tied to what has been the research focus of my academic career, which is focusing on the global governance of xenophobia and racism. My research focus is primarily on migrants, but I work on the treaties that are relevant for my mandate. So I think that background was really prepared me for the position. From looking around among the other special rapporteurs, I'm often the youngest in the room. As far as I can tell, the UN has not said anything about my being the youngest. I think it's probably against the law for them to be keeping track of those sorts of things. But I think it is worth noting for me that one of the reasons why I even decided to apply was just the mentorship that I had within the UN and even here at UCLA. And for those of you who are junior scholars or who are thinking about, how do I enter the UN, I think too often you don't even apply because you don't see somebody who looks like you in a position doing that work. But I had support from inside and outside to say you should really try for this. So I would say the expertise that I gained as an academic and then also as a clinician. I teach an international human rights clinic, which means that I'm doing the practical work of applying international human rights law to cases. And then also having lived in different parts of the world and having practiced human rights in those contexts and also experienced racial discrimination and subordination. I think all of those things were important factors, I think, in terms of qualifying for the job. It is a process of state appointment, so there is that kind of political dimension to it, but we are not really privy to what happens behind those scenes. So I will leave it there.
I thought I was the youngest one up here.
I mean, you're still in the duck category. I think duck aging is different.
The old duck up here. What equips you to be a special rapporteur, at least for the ILC, is you do have to be a member of the ILC. And there's only 34 members of the commission. We come from the different regional groupings of the UN system. You do have to be nominated by a government and then elected by the UN General Assembly. So there's a process there that you have to go through before you could even possibly qualify to be a special rapporteur for the ILC, which does mean we have a relatively small pool of individuals to draw from. We can't just reach out to the expert in a particular area across the globe and say, why don't you be our special rapporteur? We just don't work that way. That does mean that many of our special rapporteurs would not probably be regarded as an expert in their topic necessarily. I don't think I was known to be somebody who was a crimes against humanity person at the time when I was selected to be a special rapporteur. Why might you be picked? I think, we tend to look on the commission for individuals who we think do have a knowledge base, at least, that would allow them to take on a particular project. Thankfully, most of the members of the commission do have a fairly deep and broad knowledge of international law, and that's how they got onto the commission. So we're certainly looking for that. I think, like Tendai, there is a resources issue. We're not paid to be members of the ILC. Actually, I think we get $1 a year, something like that. So the UN can say we're paid. Is that true? Yeah. I haven't noticed it turning up in my bank account or anything. So we don't get paid to be a member of the ILC, and then we don't get paid anything further to be a special rapporteur. So as Tendai was saying, that means that whatever you're doing, whether it's research, whether it's travel, whether it's whatever, you need to have some sort of institutional support to make it happen. Being at a university is a wonderful way to have that access to the library and research assistance, and I use my human rights clinic for a significant part of my project. And so when somebody steps up at the commission and says, I'd like to be a special rapporteur, one of the issues that at least is thought about is, are they coming out of a setting where they would have that kind of institutional support? The last thing I would say is that, and we may get into this with other questions, there is very much a symbiotic relationship between the commission and governments. We send our projects ultimately to governments. And I think probably on the minds of some in the commission is, will this person be the kind of person that's aware of government interests and government concerns? And that doesn't mean you accept whatever it is governments may want, but they're kind of the client, if you will, of the ILC, and therefore, you know, I served for 11 years in the State Department, so I have a sense of how that government works, and, you know, having some ability to sort of operate in both the academic and the governmental sphere, I think, is useful as a special rapporteur at the ILC.
So when I became special rapporteur, I had been an international human rights lawyer for about 21 years. And I think however young we are going in, or middle-aged, we come out a lot older at the end.
At least look it.
It is very, very hard work, but I really believe in it, and I'm so excited to be doing it and to have such wonderful colleagues. But I think I couldn't have done it without, in my case, the 20 years of preparation, though I think it is very important to have the perspectives of younger people in the work as well, critically important. But for me, I look back and I think each of the building blocks was essential. So actually my engagement with ASIL over many years since I was a law student, I think played a tremendous role in helping me have a network, being familiar with human rights issues in many different regions of the world. It's very difficult to follow all the regions of the world, so I really encourage you to remain engaged with this wonderful organization. I was a legal advisor for Amnesty International when I first graduated from law school, and that experience was absolutely tremendous in terms of the country missions, sometimes very difficult country missions that I went on in terms of dealing with governments, in terms of working very closely with civil society and human rights defenders on the ground, and working with other human rights groups that allowed me to really work with frontline defenders. That is the name of a wonderful organization. It's also, a general category of very important people doing the work around the world, because today is so right that the knowledge exchange and the collaboration with civil society, with human rights defenders is a critically important part of the job. In my case, I would say, and I don't think this is a requirement, but being the special rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, it's been particularly helpful to be a person who is of a sort of bicultural background. One of my parents is from the United States and one of my parents was from North Africa, and I think being able to look at the world from the different vantage points of those two regions, where I also in part grew up, has really helped me do the work.
Great. And let the record show that neither Sean nor I prompted that lovely commercial about the value of ASIL membership in preparing yourself to be a rapporteur. But it's nonetheless true. So we talked about the fact that special rapporteurs are not compensated, apart from the $1 that Sean receives annually. Surely one reason for that is to maintain their independence. At least that's the stated reason. So how important is independence to your role? Are there any ways in which being an independent voice gives you special authority or special influence in the situations in which you find yourselves? And I guess I'd extend that by saying, are there any ways in which being independent hampers your effectiveness? For example, by requiring that you keep the government that you are dealing with at arm's length. Whoever would like to take a crack at that?
Sure, I'll start us off. So it's a great question, and I think at the outset it may be worth pondering, what does it mean to be independent exactly? So for the International Law Commission, all 34 members are expected to operate as independent experts. but easily 1/3 to 1/2 of them are sitting government officials. And that includes some of our special rapporteurs. So the special rapporteur for protection of the environment and armed conflict is a Finnish foreign ministry government official. So in some sense, you might say that doesn't look so independent, but I think the way we view independence is you're pursuing as a special rapporteur what you think the law is, and you're not pursuing your own government's view as to what the law is, and you're certainly not taking instructions from the government. That's the way I think we tend to think about independence. Now, it is the case as well, as I alluded to earlier, that we tend to view as our clients governments, meaning all governments. So what we're trying to do is look at the law that exists around our world and determine what is the customary international law rule, what are the implications of particular treaty rules, if we need to fill in some gaps, what are the ways that we might think about progressively developing the law to fill in those gaps. We're independent in the sense that it doesn't matter to us what any one or two or three governments' position is, but we do care about the position of, let's say, 150 governments, or 160, or 170, because that's a form of at least opinio juris, if not state practice, right? And that's a part of what drives the system. So in a way, we're separate, but we're also feel embedded in the system in a way that creates a certain strong interest in government views that we feel need to be the basic fodder of the work that we do.
So Tendai, what about you? What does independence require of you? Is it an advantage? And if so, how? Is it a disadvantage?
So I'll say, and I think this is a really important question, and to go back to your question about independence and compensation, I think the lack of compensation doesn't really tie to independence in any kind of meaningful way, right? Because we find ways to do the work that we need to do, and you might imagine that the ways that we find ways to do the work we do may raise the sorts of concerns that you think getting rid of compensation introduces. And I think the lack of compensation actually undermines, in my own opinion, the value or the position of special rapporteur, because it then skews towards well-resourced individuals being able to do the job, when expertise on human rights law and human rights violations definitely doesn't track access to resources. You might even think that those two things are inversely correlated. And so I think when you look at the special rapporteurs and when you look at who's doing the work, it's typically people from elite institutions and elite parts of the world that can afford to do that. Not across the board, but for the most part. And the success at the job in some ways can be tied to that. So in terms of independence and compensation, I actually think there's something about the lack of compensation that introduces other sorts of concerns about independence. And then in terms of what I've come to understand as the true value of independence as a special rapporteur, so I thought, oh, it will be just about independence from the states, and this is going to be about, being able to speak freely without state interference. But I think that the actual, one of the most important forms of independence is actually independence from the UN human rights system itself, right? So you think about OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, other UN human rights bodies, which are constrained in different ways. So they are close to states, they are funded by states, they are in many ways beholden to states in ways that I think shifts or shapes the positions that they can take on human rights, not for nefarious reasons, but for existential reasons to do with the fact that they have to remain in existence. So independence from the UN human rights system and its institutions means that you can speak about what the law is and how it should apply in a way that is free of some of those concerns. Another way in which independence from the global human rights system is valuable, I think, is that there's many ways in which the global human rights system, as represented by the UN, is distant from the groups and individuals who are experiencing the worst forms of human rights violations. And in my case, it's to do with racial equality and racial subordination. And in my position, I am more nimble and can do more work to prioritize, civil society, social movements, survivors of human rights violations in a way that, again, isn't constrained by some of the kind of bureaucratic and other dimensions that may hinder the UN human rights system from having that closeness. So for me, independence from the UN human rights system itself has proven to be, I think, one of the true values of having these independent experts nonetheless participate in that system.
I couldn't agree more with Tendai's very eloquent remarks about this, and would just add a few things. I mean, I think our independence is critically important, and I always joke, it means we're not paid. I mean, that is sort of what it is sort of suggested, that somehow because we're not paid by the UN system, that is the reason we are independent. And I think we really have to explore alternative funding models to surmount some of the problems that you've been talking about, whether it's creating some sort of a trust fund, or at least that would enable rapporteurs to take 1 or 2 years off from their other jobs during their tenure as a special rapporteur, if not, fully provide them with some sort of a stipend for the 6 years. I think there's also a gender to this. I think the whole idea of special rapporteur was sort of developed initially as a model that was based on the lives of a sort of stereotypical life of men with stay-at-home female partners who were taking care of things at home, and neither female nor male special rapporteurs, for the most part, have that life anymore. And it is a model that is very difficult to sustain, because you ultimately end up with 2 full-time jobs, because we know that the 3-month commitment is absolutely not true. If you want to do the job properly, you really have to do it on a full-time basis. So I think we need to explore other creative alternatives to secure our independence. I think our independence means we can be multi-directionally critical. That is to say, critical of any state, in any region, any regional organization, any non-state actor. And I think what is happening in the world, unfortunately, is that so much human rights criticism is limited to criticism along political lines. And I think we're able to really transcend that and really sort of manifest universality, not only preach it, but practice it because of that independence. And I think a piece of that is also criticizing the UN system where that's warranted. I really believe in the UN system and the UN human rights system, but sometimes it too needs to be held to account. And I've been so pleased to see special rapporteurs do that very courageously, such as Philip Alston, the rapporteur on extreme poverty, raising the issue of the UN's role, unfortunately, in the spread of cholera in Haiti. There's a current debate going on between the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights about whether or not that Special Rapporteur can put a very outspoken report about the state of human rights defenders in our world today on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He spoke very publicly about that in his interactive dialogue with the General Assembly, and I really do hope indeed that he prevails, because here we are 20 years after the adoption of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, watching really an all-out attack on human rights defenders in many parts of the world. So we need to secure our independence, but I think we need to explore creative models so that that independence is not built in exclusive ways.
Very good. A major part of your work consists of information gathering. So how much do you depend on the governments you are monitoring to get access to that information? And what do you do when that cooperation from governments is lacking? I'd like to take that one.
I started first before, so. Just.
So I can speak to that, though, in a rather limited way, because I've only been Special Rapporteur for a year, and so the number of kind of interactions that I've had where cooperation has been an issue have been limited, and I'm curious to hear what Karima will say, given her much longer experience. And so I'm thinking about the country visit context. I think that's where government cooperation is oftentimes the most crucial and can be the most tricky. So as Karima mentioned, one of the things that we do is fact-finding missions, so we can go to countries, produce a report on the situation. In my case, it would be on racial equality in that country. You require the permission of a state to do an official country visit, and it can be difficult to get states to agree. So with that, we have very little leverage. If a state doesn't want you to come into its borders, it doesn't want you to come into its borders. I think what can be more difficult is where you have acceptance of a country visit, and then once you are on the territory, you're in negotiation about spaces you can enter and spaces you can not enter. I think the most challenging such experience I had was, having given permission to enter a detention facility by the national executive, but then arriving at a facility, and then not being able to permit it to go in and actually make an assessment as to what the human rights conditions are. And that can be a tricky situation, because when you're writing your report, if you have said you've been to the facility and you haven't been able to get in, you can legitimize violations on the inside if you are unable to speak to them. And I actually had an incident that was really difficult, where I arrived at an immigration detention facility, was met by an administration that just would not let us into the facility. It was me and two other women, and we were, treated in fascinating ways, essentially. But the strategy that I used there was just to make clear that refusal, lack of cooperation, is something that we can and do document as well. And including that information reflects badly upon states. And usually that kind of a conversation, and in that case it works. They realized that it was probably worse to have not permitted me to go in, because then I say I'll just rely on the civil society accounts, which is not what they want. So this is a very granular example of how state cooperation can make the work difficult, and how it really does become about, using what resources you have, which is, I guess, is shining light and using the sources of information that you have to attempt to change minds. I've actually been very pleasantly surprised. I thought that everything would be a battle with states in terms of getting access to countries, in terms of putting out reports. I actually just presented my first report to the General Assembly, which is on nationalist populism as a threat to racial equality. And the report actually names administrations and it names countries. And honestly, I thought it was going to be, I thought they were going to throw things at me in that session. I really thought it would be a contentious conversation. And I was surprised to actually have states engage and be really interested in thinking about how there might be implementation of certain aspects of the report. So I would say so far, in terms of lack of state cooperation, it has been a lot easier than I anticipated before. But when you do get into those moments, it can be very tricky.
Karina?
So I use a range of methods to get information. Sometimes I do calls for submissions. I have one out right now for my 10th anniversary report, because it's about to be the 10th anniversary of the mandate on cultural rights in the spring. And so literally you put out a call to states, to civil society organizations, and anyone, experts, academics around the world, to submit information. Of course, the problem is that there are some language limitations around that. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights works effectively in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, and we're able to supplement that a bit with other languages that my staff and I speak. But there are, those are still big limitations that I've been thinking about in terms of how we communicate more broadly. And the submissions process can be very, very helpful in preparing thematic reports. I never rely solely on information from the government or from one particular civil society source. I try to be extremely picky about checking everything. I think sometimes I may drive the staff in Geneva crazy. This is what happens when you have a law professor as a special rapporteur. I always want to check everything as many times as possible, and I think that meticulous fact-finding, subject to the limitations that we are given of our processes and resources, meticulous fact-finding is a critical aspect of the integrity of the special procedures system, of which special rapporteurs are one part. You see governments take very different approaches. I went on a mission to Malaysia in the fall of 2017, and the Malaysian government's strategy at that time, even though there were some real human rights challenges in that country then, was to provide me with as much information as possible. It wasn't necessarily always the information that I wanted, but really detailed presentations and submissions of material. I went to Poland just a month ago, and I'm quite concerned about the rather deteriorating situation of cultural rights in Poland and the rise of various forms of hatred in that country. But the Polish government really did not engage and did not often in the meetings provide the information that I needed, and I got whiplash because I'd spend half the day with the government and then half the day with civil society, and you'd hear sort of completely different things. And I have to take advantage of this moment, even though it's slightly off point of this question, to express my strong, warm solidarity with Polish civil society, which is facing the potential of a massive hate march tomorrow in Poland, on what is a very important anniversary of the 100th anniversary of Poland regaining its independence, but unfortunately is likely to be an event which is manipulated by far-right hate groups, such as the kind of groups that Tendai mentioned in her most recent important statement. But relying on multiple sources of information is critically important. And let me say one last thing, which is, I think, and this goes across the board, whether it's with providing information, whether it is responding to requests for invitation, I think we have to up the cost to states for not cooperating with the Special Rapporteur system. I remember the Mexican ambassador saying in a quite impassioned way in the orientation for Special Rapporteurs when I began that he was very frustrated because he felt like the Mexican government cooperates a great deal with the Special Rapporteur system and therefore gets a great deal of criticism, and other governments who don't engage, who don't invite rapporteurs and so on in the same region were not subjected to the same amount of criticism. And I think we do have to really find ways for, making clear publicly what information we've asked for, what we've not gotten, what states are failing to do in this regard.
So this is where my status as the odd duck, I think, really comes to the fore, the old odd duck, because the mission that I have as a special rapporteur is really quite different from Tendai and Karima. In no circumstances is expected to go to any particular country for the purpose of investigating that country and perhaps criticizing its conduct. That's just not what I'm doing, right? So what am I doing? I ask myself that question often. Hopefully I can answer it. What I'm doing is trying to draft what might be a convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. So think about the Torture Convention or maybe the Genocide Convention, although that's quite old now. Super copy the Torture Convention into a document and take out torture and put in crimes against humanity. At some level, that's what the ILC is doing. It's not quite that, but it's along those lines. So you might have thought the Special Rapporteur for Crimes Against Humanity must be investigating country X or country Y. You'll see I'm not even willing to say what the countries might be. But that's not our job. That's not our job. Our job is to try to figure out what we think are appropriate global rules for addressing a particular scenario. And in that context, when I try to gather up information, it's actually very much in government's interest to provide information. Because if they're trying to steer the project in a particular way, the way to do that is to try to influence the Special Rapporteur and the Commission as a whole. So we do, on an annual basis, ask questions of governments in our annual report, and governments are then given a period of time to submit answers to those questions. For example, in preparation for my first report, I asked the question, do you, as a government, have a national law on crimes against humanity? What does that law say? Under what circumstances can you exercise jurisdiction over an alleged offender of crimes against humanity, right? So that's to gather up the information about what's already out there that might help guide the project as to what we could do that's helpful or not helpful. And not helpful meaning that we're not trying to do something that will make it hard for governments to join a treaty. And that will be the case if we adopt something that's totally inconsistent with, 70 countries' national laws on crimes against humanity, right? So we gather information that way. I would say the dominant aspect, though, is research by the Special Rapporteur, him or herself, perhaps in conjunction with others. I have reached out to other academics and so on to try to get information, and they're very willing to contribute because they're excited about the project. NGOs have been very active in providing information to me, particularly Amnesty International has written now, I think, 5 reports about the Commission's project and what they like and don't like about it. And the last thing I'll mention is most ILC special rapporteurs haven't done this, but I have felt it important to go out to the different regions and hold workshops for a day or two where I try to get into the room academics, practitioners, government officials, NGOs from across the region. So I've done this in Europe, in Nuremberg, I've done it in Asia, at Singapore, recently did it in South America, in Lima. And, you know, it's a wonderful way of getting a lot of voices in the room from across a spectrum, in part to make sure our project, you know, takes into account all these different voices. But again, in part, at the end of the day, I want the project to be acceptable. And previously I said acceptable to governments, but the reality is behind the governments are the civil society actors. And if they're not excited about this, then many governments may not be excited about it either. So part of the idea is to raise awareness, get the ideas in, shape the project in a manner that we think ultimately will succeed.
Okay. Now this may be more of a question for our Human Rights Council rapporteurs, given what Sean has said about the differences in the way he is expected to go about his mandate. But I wonder if either of you have found yourself in a situation in which you were granted access, but once you were there, efforts were made to conceal information or to prevent you from getting what you needed, or perhaps to misdirect or mislead you. And I'm not asking you about any particular country. I assume that would not be something you'd want to talk about. But in general terms, have you encountered this? And if so, how did you uncover the concealment? And what did you do about it?
I would say for me where this has come up the most has been around the individual communications procedure, and that very often when I raise individual cases, the information that may come in the reply from the government does not coincide with the information that is available from civil society. Although very open, I mean, so occasionally you do get governments that sort of confess very openly to what they're doing because they think it's fine. And this was the case, for example, with the Palestinian poet Ashraf al-Fayed, who was sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia for the crime of poetry. And the Saudi government wrote it. The sentence was later commuted. He's now serving a 7-year sentence and still facing potentially 700 lashes due to his poetry. I've been trying to get this case on the map now with the current important discussion about human rights in Saudi Arabia. But the Saudi government said very openly that it was for his atheism, which, you know, I don't know whether he's an atheist or not, but it's neither here nor there. But it was very interesting to see that approach of just saying right in the reply what they were doing. On the other hand, that isn't usually the tack that you get from governments in the replies. You do get a lot of obfuscation, misdirection, false information. Sometimes I think even central governments may not necessarily inform themselves or be aware of what is happening in the local level in some of these cases, but sometimes it's just plain lying. And again, the problem is how to hold them accountable, because we have this communications process. We send a communication. The government has the option of replying. It's confidential. After 3 months, the communication and the reply, if any, are published, and that's where it sits. And so the challenge is finding the resources to go back and really expose the misinformation or try to implement your recommendations from the communication in the first place. I've had cases where I have, with other special rapporteurs, sent a communication and the person has subsequently, and sometimes just a few days later, even been killed. And there is still no way, other than making a public statement of denunciation, which is a little bit late, sadly, there is really no way to hold the state accountable, and that is a source of great frustration.
So Karim has given a very comprehensive answer, and the only thing I would add is I've had the strange experience of having difficulty getting access to information for reasons sometimes actually that don't seem nefarious, but that have to do with just completely different conceptions of what counts as a racial equality or racial discrimination issue. And so, you know, I've had interactions with government officials where, I'll say, well, I'm trying to understand, the structural or institutional ways in which individuals are being excluded on the basis of their race or their national origin or religion or whatever it might be. And the international law that applies, mandates such an approach. But they will say, well, that isn't, you're asking for data on, statistics and education. You should only be speaking to our department that deals with anti-discrimination legislation, for example. Or I've had meetings with attorney generals, and I'll say, I'm here to discuss the racial discrimination issues, and say, well, that's not in my scope. That's not really something I deal with. So I think in my work and in my particular mandate, the prevalence of very kind of narrow conceptions of what counts as a racial equality issue, which contradicts what international human rights standards require, often results in states not being forthcoming about information, but then insisting that they don't need to be because they don't see it as actually within the scope of my mandate. So that's a different sort of barrier, but a very real one.
As you anticipated, Mark, I haven't had these sorts of issues. In fact, if anything, it's been slightly the converse, which is maybe interesting, in that I've found that governments read my reports very carefully. And there's one instance where I had a government contact me to say, we read your report and we read footnote 362, and we think you miscited to this treaty, and this is important to us. Could you please double check it? And I did double check it, and they were right. So I issued a corrigendum, which we can do. It's the only one I've had to do, thankfully. I guess I feel good about that. But it was the kind of the other way around. They were wanting to be sure I was spot on and capturing things correctly, and not in some fashion steering things in a direction that wasn't correct, and that's fine.
But it sounds like this is an excellent byproduct of your work, that you can get them to engage at that level of seriousness. I'm involved with the World Justice Project, and we do a rule of law index, and there are certain countries that comb through every datum that we provide so that they can challenge us.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very healthy thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
So let me follow up on that with all of you. How do you feel your presence in the country affects the situation faced by indigenous NGOs and activists with whom you engage? Does it make life easier for them, or does it perhaps in some instances make life tricky?
Well, again, I'm the odd duck on this. It's just a totally different process. I would say these workshops I've been doing, NGOs are delighted to be able to participate in them. ICRC is delighted to be able to participate in it. Human Rights Watch and so on. There's a lot of women's groups and violence and trafficking type groups that are very interested, because crimes against humanity is this wide swath of possible types of criminal acts that rise to a certain level and qualify as crimes against humanity. So huge amount of interest out there, and certainly when we've done these workshops, it's been no problem getting people in the room. I don't think that, the premise of your question might be in part, does it help empower them in some sense? Does it bring them to the table and give them a voice and so on? And because of my mandate, that's not really what's going on. I think it's more just they want to be able to influence the process that's happening largely in Geneva, and I'm very happy to let them do that.
So again, for me, it's only been a year. And in the year, I have found that civil society organizations, social movements have been really excited about having a special rapporteur visit and shed light on the causes and initiatives that they've been working on. Because in much of the world, having the UN endorse a cause or a violation that you have been arguing is the case can actually assist or kind of provide an additional lever against the government. This is not always necessarily the case. My country visit to the UK, for example, on the second day of my presence in that country, the tabloids had headlines, saying UN envoy comes to scold Britain about Brexit, right? So different actors responded very differently, and I wish the UN had the kind of power that it was characterized as having in some of those articles. It was kind of perhaps giving the UN a bigger role than it has. But in general, I have found that civil society and social movements tend to view the interventions of special rapporteurs positively. And I actually think the most successful visits and the most successful interventions are ones that build on work that is already being done locally or within that country. Because again, we have very little external machinery that is going to force change in any given country. And so before I go and do a country visit, I actually try and understand what issues the country itself and the people who are living in there have identified as the priority ones, so that the visit can be a catalyst or a lever and actually work with something that's already on the ground, as opposed to coming in a way that's completely disconnected from what's happening. That's not to say that there may not be vulnerabilities or threats that may be introduced to groups in light of their affiliation with my presence in the country. And the only way I have found to manage that is to just be really explicit about my inability to protect people who engage with me. And so all of my calls for submissions and all of my meetings with civil society actors, I start out by saying, I have no means of protecting anyone. And even in the invitation, I'll say I have no means of protecting anyone. So that groups that are vulnerable enough where there can be retaliation for engagement with them, they can exercise agency and actually say, this isn't safe. And that's the most that I've been able to do.
I think the security issues are incredibly important, and I'm going to be totally honest, even though we're recording, and say I don't actually think the UN system spends enough time really dealing systematically with this issue, in particular with the security of communications. And I think we need to get much more sophisticated in the ways that we communicate, with guidance from our colleague, the Special Rapporteur on privacy, amongst others. I completely share your concern about that. It's really the first do no harm principle. I've had very awkward situations, for example, where human rights defenders have come to see me under very difficult circumstances, and I've had the government sort of staking out the hotel where I was meeting people, and you have to try to sort of get them out of the building in a safe way. I think the most difficulty that my mandate has had was on a country mission to Vietnam. That was my predecessor, Farida Shahid of Pakistan. And there were a great deal of security issues, not only for civil society, but even for people like translators working with interpreters, working with the mission. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I found civil society to be tremendously excited about the presence of a special rapporteur in the country. And I should just explain very quickly, because my mandate may be a little bit less familiar. So the mandate on cultural rights focuses on Article 15 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the right of everyone to participate in cultural life without discrimination. It also includes artistic freedom, scientific freedom, and it also has a grounding in Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, very important in countries like this one that have not ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So when I go into a country, it is primarily NGOs, civil society groups that are working in these areas, the cultural sector, artists, people working on minority cultural rights, indigenous cultural rights, but there's also a relationship with freedom of expression, with a variety of forms of discrimination, freedom of religion or belief. And I've been very excited by the way in which I think NGOs want to collaborate, prepare extensive information, and you meet people doing the most amazing things. I remember being in Mitrovica, Mitrovica, depending on which way you pronounce it, in Kosovo, which is a divided city, and meeting a Kosovar Serb activist who was organizing programs with Kosovar Albanians and Roma to collectively visit the cultural sites of all of those groups and really sort of affirm their importance together and learn about their importance together. And of course, he couldn't continue the work because he didn't have funding. And that is one place where I really feel that we have a role to try to shine a light on those kind of very positive projects and try to get them to support and to try to get people like that heard. One of the things I'm most thrilled about is when I can find a way to invite people from the civil society groups that I've met in country to speak at the UN, because it is amazing to me how little we actually wish to listen to people on the front lines of any particular issue that we're talking about, and I see part of our role is changing that.
Very good. I want to leave lots of time for questions. We've got about 15 minutes left in the session, so let me just ask one final question of all the panelists, and that is, if you could change one thing about the way that the Special Rapporteur system operates, what would it be? What would you change?
So I'm going to go first, not because I think I've thought about this more than my two compatriots, but because I'm going to have to leave after I answer, and I just was checking the traffic to LAX. I think that the thing that I would change is tied to resources, and this is resources that would bring voices that are absent from human rights knowledge production into the conversation. So when I produce a thematic report, one of the things I'm really thinking about is how I am contributing to the production of human rights knowledge in a very significant way, and I find that my access to states is wide open. I can have bilateral meetings with them, I have funding to do that, I can access them by email, whatever it might be. And I also have access to civil society organizations that are very well funded. But as Karima was pointing out, the groups that I tend to struggle to reach are those who are on the front lines of the worst forms of oppression and subordination that are at the core of my mandate. And I think those groups and those actors are central not just for information about what violations they're experiencing, but they're central also for understanding what it would mean to have human rights principles that actually apply to the lived experiences of human rights violations. So really they are really superior epistemic sources that I do not have the resources reliably to be engaged with. And so really thinking about how the UN, the funding we receive, the ways we disseminate information could allow for more reliable channels of communication on that front would be the thing that I would change. And I will conclude my remarks by actually saying thank you to the Promise Institute for Human Rights here at UCLA, which has made it easy to do some of the work that I think is really vital in this regard, and because they are part of hosting this event, I thought it was worthwhile. And then also thanking ASIL, not least because it was pointed out that Karima did and I hadn't, but it's separate from that. I do think that the networks that ASIL provides, you know, it basically opens up a universe of experts in different areas of international law. Yesterday I had a meeting with somebody who was participating in the Practitioners Forum, who's working on new information technologies and, you know, algorithmic bias, for example. And through him, I'm going to be able to do all kinds of really interesting things. So the networks that the society provides have been also really valuable, and I imagine will continue to be that way. So thank you, all of you, and I'm so sorry to run at this important stage, but I want to thank you all for the platform and the time
Thank
as
you,
well.
and safe travels.
If I miss my flight, I'll just come right back.
We'll still be here.
A big bon voyage. I mean, this is one of the big challenges of being Special Rapporteur. You're sort of on a plane all the time. I think the Special Rapporteur on the environment needs to help us figure out how to offset our carbon footprint because it's massive. And I'm actually no longer joking when I say that. I really think we do need to do an environmental assessment of the work that we are doing. But I wanted to jump in because I think some of what I'm going to say piggybacks onto what Tendai said very eloquently. I think we are trying to deal with 21st century human rights challenges with 20th century tools. And this is a problem, and we have got to develop a set of 21st century tools. So what do? We write 10,700-word reports that look like this. We're not allowed to put pictures or graphics in them. There's a crisis around reading in the world, which is, of course, itself a cultural rights issue. It's very hard to get people to read these reports. We need new ways of communicating. I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I'm on Twitter. You can follow mandate-related work at UNSR Culture, but we need a whole new model, I think, of YouTube videos, Instagram, finding new ways to share the ideas in our reports, to communicate with young people. We need advice from you, actually, young people, about how best to do that. I'm trying to use cultural figures in this work, so I was very honored recently to have Wole Soyinka, the first African writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, who came with me when I presented my report on universality, cultural diversity, and cultural rights to the General Assembly, and did a really wonderful talk in a Facebook Live event with me in which he was talking about humanity needing to decide in which direction it wants to time travel, backward or forward. And just speaking in such a beautiful way that I think only an artist can. We're not allowed to show graphics in the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council. We're not allowed to show pictures. We need to fight for new modes of communication and also getting the media interested in what we're doing. So when the United States very tragically pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council last summer, something which I deplore in my latest report, three of us rapporteurs who hold US nationality wrote an op-ed criticizing that move, explaining how it was bad for the United States and for the Human Rights Council and human rights around the world, and no one would publish that op-ed. So we really need to find new ways to get new sectors interested in the work, and it's a really collaborative enterprise, so we need your help in doing that, and I really welcome the opportunity to work with many of you.
One last word before we go to questions.
Well, I don't think most members of the ILC even know what Instagram is. Start with that. So we're definitely dinosaurs in that category.
I thought you were a duck.
Yes.
Now I'm
Well,
confused.
ducks have a relationship to dinosaurs, I think, in some way. In any event, this may sound like a bit of a hyper-academic response to the question, but I feel that special rapporteurs of the ILC are not entirely clear at the outset as to what it is they're doing exactly. So I mentioned what I'm doing. I'm writing a treaty. I think that's fairly clear. You know, we're in a sense, I've got free range to write this thing any way I want, as long as I can get the commission to agree, knowing that at the end of the day, governments either ratify or don't ratify, in which case it either is law or not law. The vast majority of our projects are not intended to be treaties anymore. We've gotten away from that quite a bit. We're doing projects that we call draft principles, draft guidelines, draft articles, which you might think that means a treaty, but even then, oftentimes at the end of the day, it's not really expected to be a treaty. So in that kind of a world where you're doing a lot of those kinds of projects, my own view is we should be very transparent. Are we codifying existing law, or are we doing something else? Are we making up new law? Are we filling in the gaps in some way? I wish that we would rise to the challenge of being more transparent about what it is we're doing, because at the end of the day, I think the Commission's reputation turns in part on not pretending that you're issuing a statement of codified law when in fact that's not what it is. And we tend to hide the ball on that a bit.
Very good. And of course, if you don't do treaties, we don't ratify them. And even if you do, we don't. So,
That's still an issue too. We could talk about that.
okay, let's go to questions. Just show of hands if you have a question. Right here in the second row. Oh yeah, actually a good idea, because we are now a little bit short of time. Let's take a few questions. So yours, and who else would like to pose a question? Gentleman in the back, and David Sloss as well.
Okay, thank you. Given the important work that the special rapporteurs do, as you mentioned, speaking truth to power, what is the best impact that the special rapporteurs can have in a policy perspective for maybe tackling some of the systemic issues that might create cultural rights issues, or, for example, racial intolerance? I'm thinking specifically to maybe imbalances internally in the agglomeration of capital, for example, internally in a country that might, incentivize racial problems, or in the field of culture, maybe some imbalances that might also exacerbate cultural, cause of cultural
good, very good. Excellent question. And in the back?
Yes, you've alluded to this a little bit, but I haven't heard it so specifically. What's your framework for an ethical code of conduct for an ethical code of conduct and how you conduct your job? I mean, does the Office of the High Commissioner provide you with sort of guidelines on how you do? I mean, you're not operating as a sort of professor or a lawyer or a judge or one of the categories that we really know. So what's the, what if you were to plagiarize your report, for example? What if you were to be bribed by a foreign government or interview someone who was at the end of getting summarily executed, something like that?
Okay. And third question, David.
This one's specifically for Karima. So you mentioned briefly your staff. My understanding is that the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights does provide some sort of staff support for the special rapporteurs, but I was hoping you could say a little bit about that, and then sort of related to that, I know a lot of the rapporteurs who are academics are basically sort of using student support, and I'm wondering to what extent you can comment on that as a way of sort of dealing with resource constraints, is basically getting student help and sort of staff for your work.
I saw a number of students in the audience perk up when you said that. So yes, the first question then was how can you best have an impact on systemic issues? Second, what framework, is there a framework for ethical conduct for people who do what you do? And a question about staff support or potential support from student interns.
I think those were all directed not at the duck. And so I'll just say two words because I think Karima's got probably much more to say on it. We have a impact on sort of global policy in the sense of if you believe in the system of international law, it's good to have an institution that's trying to develop that law and recognize it, and we try to be relatively neutral in doing that. We have no ethical code of conduct that I'm aware of. It's a great question, but
I hope you would have been told.
I'm trying not to plagiarize, that kind of. And as I said, no staff support really at all.
So thank you very much for these very good questions, and I don't want to speak too long, but they all sort of merit a long answer. I'll be as brief as I can. The question about systemic issues is a very important one, and I think that's something we try to balance in our work as special rapporteur, so it's very important to look at specific cases, especially cases where there's a great deal of risk to human rights, and we can do that through the communications procedure. But you can also do a communication about a pattern, right, about more of a sort of an underlying issue or a bigger, broader issue. So a number of us did a joint communication, for example, about the possible human rights impact of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, looking much more broadly than at any one specific case. And that was actually a communication that went to many states. And I think the thematic reports allow us to look more systemically as well. The problem, of course, is the implementation of any of this. And I'm hoping to turn as many of my thematic reports as possible into implementation toolkits, but that also requires resources and time. But would love to talk with students about their possible contribution in that regard. The Code of Conduct, great question, but I feel like I'm back in the General Assembly because states are always yelling at us about the Code of Conduct. And whenever you do anything they don't like, they accuse you of being in violation of the Code of Conduct. But your point is a very fair one. We too need to be transparent and accountable. There is a code of conduct that was adopted by states. I think it actually doesn't address a number of the very real kind of ethical issues that can come up for special procedures mandate holders. It's much more focused on states trying to keep us from doing things they don't want us to do. And very often when they raise the code of conduct, they mean that you've gone beyond the sort of terms of your mandate as they interpret it. And I'm so grateful to the Russian Federation because they're there at every single meeting of the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council to tell me that I have gone beyond the terms of my mandate as it is set out in the Code of Conduct. And of course, their view of the terms of that mandate are different than mine. Special procedures mandate holders do have privileges and immunities of the UN system when they operate in this capacity, and we know this because there's been an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice to this effect when there was an attempt to prosecute a former special rapporteur, actually in Malaysia, for his activities as Special Rapporteur. There is a coordinating committee of Special Rapporteurs that is our governing body that also could take up the issue of any ethical concerns regarding the behavior of special procedures. But it would, I think one has to be very careful about thinking what, if any, role the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights would have in that, because part of our independence is I think, very much guaranteed by our independence also from OHCHR, but it certainly would be something that states could raise, and I think it's something the special rapporteurs need to keep thinking about. The last question about staff, we're in a bit of a tricky situation because we work with staff who don't work for us. So you are not the boss of the person who works for you, and that is a very awkward situation to be in. I'm very grateful for the help of the staff and often very dedicated staff who often themselves are in rather fragile contract situations, as is often the case at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But there's some real challenges, including the fact that different rapporteurs have different levels of staffing. And if you have a mandate that gets a lot of funding, so human rights defenders is an example of that, you have many more staff than other mandates that are not getting funding, and that is an imbalance that really needs to be addressed. At the UC Davis, I'm really grateful to the law school because I run something called the UN Human Rights Practicum, which is a class in which students can work with me essentially as part of my staff, and sometimes I'm able even to get funding to take them with me to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, and they have really made a great contribution to the research, although I'm very careful in terms of quality control and oversight, and I think that that's critically important. But I would love to see, I'm so grateful to the UCLA Law School for the invitation and the wonderful welcome here. I would love to see a discussion across the UC system about what that system might be able to do to support the special rapporteurs, because, you know, another advertisement, it is, I believe, the only university system in the world that actually has 4 sitting UN rapporteurs on its faculty. So I think that would be something great to explore.
And that was so fortunate for us that that is the case. I just want to thank both of you. We've already thanked Tendai, but the 3 of you really are doing extraordinary and extraordinarily important work. We thank you for that. We thank you for being with us at this program. And thank you all for joining us. Please.